Hello people, we're back online. Hopefully everyone can hear me nice and clearly. Welcome to the Friday session. Today we're going to go through images from 4 different people, and before we get started, obviously there was some huge news this week that everyone's fully aware of, I'm sure, but just in case you weren't, that massive worldwide news is that Capture One has been updated. There's now a new release, 20.0.4. The people that have already got Capture One, you need to download that update. It fixes a few bugs. One of the bugs apparently was the issue that we had a few days ago when it came to copying dust spot corrections. But it also includes now some more camera support for the newer Canon models and Nikon models and so on. So for those of you that already have Capture One, head over to the website, download the new version, update your software, keep it going bug-free. The other thing, obviously, the original offer, the 25% off Pro, is finished as of the 24th, but there's still the option of 25% off Sony and Fuji versions of Capture One until the end of this month. So again, if people want to save money, head over there now. Okay, so hello Vicky from Scotland, yay! So let's get going in Capture One. Right, first off, let's start with an image that Darren has sent me. So, really nice image, really cool silhouette. We're going to cover today a couple of things. So one is around, again, some of that high dynamic range recovery that we've done before. One of the things we're going to cover today is Keystone Correction, specifically from above. So a lot of people struggle with the Keystone Tool, and we're going to go through that. There's a really good image as an example we can use for me in. We're going to go through a black and white conversion. And specifically not using the standard black and white conversion, but actually using the black and white tool, which again, some people struggle with the understanding of how that works. We'll cover that. And then we'll go into some city stuff, hopefully, if we've got time. So let's get started on this image from Darren. So again, just like we were talking about earlier, cameras or modern cameras now have got such a... Hi Ian, cool, your image is up in a minute. She said he's in. Okay. So modern cameras collect huge amounts of data. They've got massive dynamic range compared to what they used to, and that's just not reflected in the JPEG or the preview you see on the screen. So this is a perfect example. If I go into this image, it's an L series Canon lens, and it was shot using a Canon 5D Mark IV. So one of the latest in the line from Canon, one of their flagship products. Let's see what the camera actually saw, rather than just the exposure that was metered for. So let's pull up our exposure and let's see, look at the shadows in isolation. There's a lot of detail there that wasn't in that first picture. In fact, the Canon's done a really good job of being able to pull up all that detail without introducing huge amounts of noise. So if we look at the original image, we're in pretty much silhouette in here, but actually all that detail is there. Same with the sky. So although the sky isn't blown out, in fact it looks like it's been metered for the sky. Let's pull down our exposure. We've got all these tones in here, and actually there's some extra cloud stuff in here. There's these lovely layers, all these different orange and yellows and so on going up. So we know we've got all that detail, but what we don't want to do, and this is the problem that the camera has, the camera only has a very blunt way of exposing. It can say, right, expose more, in which case the sky is going to be blown out, or expose less, in which case the shadows are going to be completely invisible. This is the tool that the camera can do. So when we're metering with our camera, we can only say, okay, do this, or as Darren's correctly done, smack bang in the middle. And we can look at the histogram up here on the top left. This chart is telling us pretty clearly that we were right up to the edge on this right-hand side, so right up to the edge of the highlights, and we were right down to the edge of the shadows as well, on the left-hand side. This is pretty much as good an exposure as you could have possibly got out of this shot. If you were using a heavier filter, so a graduated filter in front of the lens on this top half, what you would have seen is this would have been darker, allowing us to pull up the shadows in the foreground a bit more. But we don't really need to with this camera in this particular shot, because we can use that high dynamic range tool to do it. So with our high dynamic range, obviously we've got the 4 sliders, we talked about them before. So you've got black, which is the bottom 10%, white, which is the top 10%, roughly. Highlights, which is typically the top sort of quarter to a third, and shadows, which is the bottom quarter to a third. So let's pull up our shadows just a touch there. And actually I'm going to pull down the blacks. And the reason is I want to particularly get this, or specifically get hold of this road. I don't actually worry too much about some of this detail in here, the fields and all the plants and so on. It's this road I want to get that goes into this line. So by pulling, so remember in version 20 of Capture One, we've got the ability not only to recover highlights and dark areas of the image, but we've also got the ability to make them individually darker. Previously, you'd have to use a luma range, or you'd have to paint over this area to do that. So with this black area, I can pull down the very, very darkest areas of the image. Let's keep the silhouette. We'll pull up the relatively dark areas of the image. So this road here. And with the highlights, I'm just going to pull them down a touch as well. Just so you remember those colors that we showed earlier. Well, they're all there. There we go, really nice. So again, just like before, what we could do is put in a mask if we want to get really specific around the road. Let's pull in our little brush. So a new mask on here, and I'm going to call it Road. And a new brush. And I'm going to use a very, very soft brush. Probably about that big. That works. I'm going to turn my mask on by pressing M. And we're just going to paint. And I'm going specifically for 100% opacity brush for this, because I actually do want quite a hard line along that road. This requires a bit of careful painting. Remember, if you paint it wrong or you get a bit of a mistake along the edge, just use the eraser tool and you can go back over yourself, and we can remove the bit that's wrong on the edge on its own. So let's just finish that line there. That's looking quite good. Okay, and then if we remember again from one of the previous sessions, we talked about the clarity tool being a mid-tone enhancing tool. So now we've pulled up these shadows. They're more grey than shadow. Let's just turn the mask off. So I can obviously increase the exposure and create a very, very fake image. But instead of doing that, what I actually want to do is pull up the texture in this road. So we're at 300% there. Let's just pull up our clarity slider. So let's just zoom back out so you can see the difference. So without and with. So it's a subtle change, but it just makes that road glow a little bit more. And then overall with this image, what I could then do is pull our contrast up, which is just going to make those blacks stand out a little bit more as well. Overall, there's not much else we're going to change on this shot. Effectively, what we could do if we wanted to is play around with a little bit with the white balance. We could really, if we wanted to, we could make it a little bit warmer. We could add a bit of a pink tint across the sky. That looks quite nice. Up here, we've got these dark spots, these little vignette spots. Genuinely up to you. So this is down to your artistic view on it. You could actually add to that. You could add some vignetting and make it look nice and warm and cozy. Or if we want to correct for that, under our lens correction up here, remember we've got this light fall off function. At f4, I'm not too worried about diffraction. I'm not going to worry about that, but I am going to use the light fall off just to even out those corners. So you see the difference in these top corners, left and right. So without the light fall off correction, that's what the lens is naturally producing. And then let's pull it up to maybe 50 and just soften that out so it's a bit more even. So if I create a clone of that variant and reset it. So again, nothing wrong with this shot at all. It's a silhouette shot of some windmills. Funnily enough, this is a shot that if those windmills were turning, it's not possible really to do an HDR because you're going to have all the blades moving in different positions. It's going to be very difficult to cut that all out. So using the high dynamic range tools within Capture One, we can still pull up all the detail. We can still leave some of the silhouettes and the shadows, but we don't have to worry about trying to blend more than one image in a stack. So that was before, that was after. It depends on what you wanted that picture to be. So some people will actually prefer the before. What we can do is, let's pull up a little bit more contrast in this shot there. That's a bit better there. But again, these are all minor changes. They're minor tweaks. What we might find is there may be a little bit of fringing on some of these. Again, we're being unfair. We're at 400% zoom. But if I were to pull in some correction on the defringe tool, it might help us. But to be honest, I don't really see much in there anyway. Okay. Oh, Mr. Grover is online. Mr. Grover. So Mr. Grover is from Capture One. He's the person that pointed out the other day thing was a bug, rather than me necessarily screwing something up. So let's go on to our next image, one from Ian. So, wonderful aerial image of the Manhattan skyline. Now, I'm actually going to use this image because it's got a perfect example of keystoning and how it's not necessary to correct every time, but if you want to, this is a nice method of correcting some of the buildings. So, this is obviously shot from an aerial position, whether it was plane, helicopter, whatever, even drone. It was, don't actually know what profile it's pulled in. Okay, it's this A7R3 from Sony. Okay, so let's go on to first thing, which is to straighten it. So if I were to straighten this image, obviously we've got a horizon here which is not quite level. It's pretty, having done it hanging out of helicopters before, it's sometimes a little bit tricky to get it exactly level where you're worrying about dropping your camera. So let's straighten that tool. Let's use the straighten tool, sorry, to straighten that image. This is great. Ian says the helicopter was wonky, not my camera. Good recovery. Right, let's go to our Keystone tool. So here's the issue. Let me apply that straighten. So I've now straightened the image. The horizon is now straight, roughly. There's actually not quite, there's a little bit of a bow there. Obviously, the higher up you go as well, you get more of the curvature as well on the horizon. So the horizon's straight, but the buildings aren't. The buildings, when you look down on them, the buildings tend to converge down towards the ground and diverge as they get nearer to you. So we end up with this bowing effect where in the middle, this building is completely straight and vertical. But onto the left and onto the right, we've got these angles, which show that it's an aerial image. There's absolutely no problem with that. But some people choose to try and correct for it. So before we even get started in terms of any color corrections or anything like that, let's use our Keystone Tools. I'm just going to correct or replace that crop back. Whoops, went one too far. Let's go back to Ian's image. Okay. So this scary tool up here, the Keystone Tool, people get very, very confused and concerned with it because what can happen if you go the wrong way, so let's just do a little bit of a silly tweak here. Let's apply that. Oh, now that's all gone wrong. So then people start trying to chase these little buttons around. Let's apply that. Oh, okay, yeah, no, okay. So this tool is actually very, very simple as long as you stick to some basic rules. So let's first of all put these on the horizon. So what I'm going to do in terms of rules, we have to find or imagine some straight lines. And those straight lines, you're going to need 2 horizontal and 2 vertical for this to work. These straight lines, if I only wanted to fix the vertical, I've got a Keystone vertical tool up here. If I only want to fix the horizontal, Keystone horizontal tool is fine as well. But in this one, I want to fix all 4 because not only have we got a little bit of lean on it, I also want to correct the vertical lines out towards the edge of the image. So rule number 1, you have to find or be able to imagine. So take the example we used the other day of the Indian doorway. Let's assume some of it is straight and go from there. The second thing is always use these circles towards the edge of the image. The reason is, if I try and tell Capture One to try and straighten an image, having used a Keystone tool this small in the middle, any tiny change by even maybe 1 pixel on here has a magnified dramatic effect out of the outsides. So what we need is to use the outside edges. And on this shot in particular, we've got a perfect line on the edge at the very top, which is our horizon. Wonderful. So we've set this dot on the horizon up here and this dot on the horizon up here. Now we have a problem because I don't have a straight line down the side. What I can do is imagine that straight line. I can use the buildings here to do that. So from this dot here, let's use this line here of these buildings and pull it down. And actually, I'm quite happy with the bottom of this frame. I don't really want to change too much of that. So I'm going to leave the bottom of the frame as if it were straight and level. So let's use that line there. And again, I'm using the bottom of the frame as my straight and level. And this one's got a really handy building here on this edge. So let's go down to the edge here. Perfect. Okay, now when I hit apply. So I am going to lose some of the image. And the reason I'm losing some of the image is because it's had to change it into this weird trapezoid shape just to be able to warp it. But let's look at now a new crop. So what I can do is use this area here. Got a bit of space there. Let's go to about there. So I've still got this building here. I've still got the Brooklyn Bridge in the shot, and I've still got this boat coming in from the bottom. That's nice. Hit our magic, either the apply button or the enter key, and we get our finished shot. So this is with Keystone Corrected. If I create a new variant of this and reset that keystone, so this is the original shot. It has more in for sure, but what it is a little bit uncomfortable. And even if I straighten it, let's go back to that tool, the straighten tool, and apply that. This is great in the middle, but the outsides still feel a little bit uncomfortable because they're leaning in. If I were to print that, it's going to feel odd against a straight frame that you've got these odd sort of angles coming into the side. Here's our new version. Straight buildings here, level horizon, straight buildings in the middle. It just feels a lot more finished than the original shot, even when the original shot is straightened. So now with this one, again, we've got some high dynamic range in here. So again, Sony a7R III is a great camera for capturing dynamic range. Let's pull down the sky. So we've got all this detail here in the sky, which is looking a little bit washed out in the original. Likewise, in our shadows, we've got a load of detail, but actually it's relatively bright to start with. So first off, let's not affect everything in Manhattan. Let's just create a new layer, and we'll call this one Sky. So with my sky layer, remember with our gradient mask, so I can drag freeform in any direction I want. If I hold down the shift key, it's going to snap it to 45-degree increments. So that's 45, 90, the other way 135. I want this to come straight down. And I want it to really, really get near to the horizon. So the midpoint I want near the horizon. Now this obviously, remember, if I turn the mask on, you can see there's 100% of the mask effect here, 50% there, and 0% here at the bottom. Now, I mentioned this before, we've never used it in any of these sessions. If I hold down the, let's go back to basics. If I move this mask, the whole mask moves, and I'm doing that by just clicking anywhere in this mask area and moving it. If I put my mask over this middle line, that's allowing me to rotate it. Don't really want to do that. What I do want to do is change the transition, the gradient. So if I pull this one here at the bottom up, it's going to keep the transition the same. It's still 150, 0, and equal spacing. But if I hold down the Option key and then scroll up, or drag this one up, now I'm leaving this top as 100, this middle part is 50%, this bottom part is 0% of mask application. However, it's a different gradient to this top half. So I can independently control the 50 to 0 gradient and the 100 to 50 gradient I can independently control as well. So I want a little bit of fall off. Don't want it to be quite that harsh. I'm going to pull that down, and you see this little light area down here. I am going to rotate this mask a little bit. Another little tip, if you're trying to rotate a mask, just like the Keystone tool, if I try and do that from the middle, any tiny movement with my mouse has a dramatic effect to that mask angle. If I do it from the outside at the edge of the image, I've got to move the mouse a lot to change the angle quite a lot. So always use the edges of the mask, or the line of the linear gradient mask, to try and change that angle. It makes it a lot easier. So, as other David has pointed out, the teacher is now watching, and teacher says that he's new experiences. Cool. Right. So we've got our mask set. I'm going to turn that mask off so we can see the effect that it's actually having on the image. And with that mask, I'm simply going to pull down our highlights and our whites a touch. And I'm actually going to probably cool down the sky a little bit there. And I'm going to add in a little bit of clarity up there too. So again, without and with. So we've got some nice blue area up here. We do have a little bit of a hazy film along here. And we've also got the ability to have that mask fall off before we hit the city. That hazy film along here, let's have a little look, because remember we've got this area masked. We don't need a luma mask in this case. We covered that the other day. But with our color editor, maybe, we're doing this a bit on the fly, let's pick on this area here. The color editor says it's got a sort of cyany tint as well as a blue tint. So what would happen if we were to change that tint to be a little more blue? Oh, that's a bit better. And we're going to up our saturation a little bit. And I'm going to reduce the lightness, so increase the darkness of that color there. I'm going to pick this color here. And it's doing the same thing. I'm just going to pull down that lightness there. So what that's doing is it's just correcting this element here of haze, and it's getting away from that greeny yellowy color and making it a bit more blue. So we've now got a much nicer bluey sky. There's a lot more detail. We can see some contrails up there. Now for the city, the bottom bit. So we've got two choices. We can try and affect the whole image and hope that the sky doesn't change too much. If we wanted to, we could of course create a new layer that's called city, and we can create the reverse mask. So let's turn our mask on. I'm going to make sure that it is a straight mask for a start. In fact, we don't want to make it straight because if we remember, we've got that little hill there. Cool. And we're going to, just like before, move that up here, and we're going to have it tail off a lot. Oops, sorry, I have to, no, sorry, another quick tip. If I hold down the Option key, I change one of these. If I hold down the Shift key, I change them together at the same time. We don't want to change them together in this case. We want to change just this top one, so we've got this fall off here. So now I know I'm only really affecting the sky area. Oh, sorry, the city area. I'm not touching the sky. Okay, so with our city selected now, and in fact, because we only want to affect the city, I'm going to also pull up this area here, so the transition is quite harsh. And with our city, we're going to actually warm up a little bit and add in a nice amount of clarity and structure. There we go. So if I look at the difference in these buildings down here, for example, without that mask, you see there's a slight green tinge to everything. So everything's a little bit washed out, a little bit greeny, a little bit yellow. By changing those two things, I'll show you what they were in a second again. But we've now got some real bright, clear lines in there. We've got some nice sharp edges in the structure. Don't use structure too much. You can end up with halos around it, but this is probably about the right amount. And then what we did was we changed the white balance only on the bottom part of the image, so only on the city. We warmed it up a little bit and we added some tint. Tint goes from green to pink if you do it too much. So be very careful with tint. The tint tool is actually designed to correct for filter problems. So what you used to get with glass filters, and you still do on some, is something called color cast. So when you would add a filter, you would end up with a cast of either pink or green, depending on the manufacturer, and the more filters you added, the cast would get stronger and stronger. So we've got this tint function in here to correct that in the white balance of a raw file. Kelvin was simply the temperature of light. So at sunset, light tends to be a little warmer, like this. At midday, it tends to be a little bit cooler, like this. And the white balance tool can correct for that and accommodate it. So obviously we've got the auto white balance tool, so I can click on this picker and get to something. That's great. But for now, I just want to do that manually and just want to get it to about there. Okay. Next little challenge in the city, we've got these are mirrored buildings. We know they're mirrored buildings, but they may be a little bit overexposed. So again, we've got our high dynamic range tool. Let's pull down the whites. Look at all that detail that was actually in the building. So there's the panes of glass. Look at this building in particular. And that was the exposure. So the exposure isn't wrong. The exposure is correct for the wider scene. If I go into this scene, it's exposed correctly. Look at our histogram. It's really nice. But the result of that is we've got some hotspots in here. So by using the high dynamic range tool, we'll pull down the white and we'll pull down the highlights a little bit. And this is applying only to the city, again, remember, because the sky is a separate layer. So this is only affecting this area here, which is red marked, not the top. So let's go back to our full wide image. So we go from this, which is the original shot, to this, which is just a bit clearer, it's a bit cleaner. What we can do with this shot as well, overall, is add on the background layer, is add a little bit of contrast, just to make it pop a touch there. I'd actually be tempted to pull our exposure down just a little bit overall on the image. But the difference between this and this, it's very small, it's very subtle. In fact, if anything, from a composition point of view, just looking at this now, what I would be tempted to do is to pull up just a bit on that crop, just to get a tiny bit more sky in the shot. Like that. That just feels a bit better. There's a bit more space on the top. But we go from out of the door of a helicopter, and obviously out of the door of a helicopter. In fact, let's go to our original, which is there. So as Ian says, the helicopter was wonky at this point. So we've got our wonky helicopter shot through to our final cityscape shot from above. And the detail, because we've pulled up some of that clarity, the detail in some of these areas here is now nice and sharp, whereas here is a little bit washed out. But we've now got all the detail of the city. Cool. Right. Let's go on to a different challenge, which is another David's shot. So not David from Capture One. That would be cheating. So this is an image. Actually, let's go here. This is the original image. This one was shot in New Zealand. It's shot with a Phase 1 camera. As a result, this thing is 150 megapixels. We've got huge amounts of detail out on the shoreline over there. It's a long exposure through the nature of frame averaging within the camera. And what's happened with this image is there's been some edits already. So this gives us a nice long sort of 2x1 landscape. I think it's 2x1. Let's have a little look. Yeah, we're at 2x1. Okay, so with this picture, David actually sent in a question, which is, would it look good in black and white? And the answer is probably yes. And this is actually a really, really good example that we can play with. As Ian, no worries. I will send you a copy of that edit so you can, A, you can see the layers and what we did, and B, you can play with it yourself. So let's pull up our black and white style. So first things first, we can of course make any of these images black and white. I'm going to clone this variant. So because I want to refer back to this one, I'm going to create a copy of this picture with all the changes. So all of these layers that were in there. Just to run through the layers, we've got a bit of a repair layer in there. We've got, what's this one? I'm not sure what that one's doing there, but it's doing something. This one is pulling down our exposure on the outside of the image and leaving that part there, and also reducing contrast on the outside to put it up here. This layer here is obviously only affecting the cloud, and that's pulling down the highlights in that high dynamic range and pulling up the clarity. And then we've obviously got the background layer, which has been pushed a little bit, and the shadows have been pulled up. So all of those things have now been copied to this clone, the same as in this one, but now I'm going to edit this one without affecting any of my changes over there. So the easiest way a lot of people will look at to apply black and white is to apply one of the Phase 1 styles. So we've got, because it was on a Phase 1 back, we can apply the Phase 1 digital camera back style. That one's quite nice, black and white neutral. Yeah. So we go from here to here. If we look at this picture here, you see this purpley area here. This is a lens flare. Let's just go into here. Got a little bit of a lens flare spot there. There's a magenta spot there, and we've got this purpley spot here. When I go to the black and white version, we still also get them here, and there's also one here. No problem with that. We could actually just darken that area down if we wanted to as well. But let's go for the black and white approach in this way. You could do the same with a style, so you could download some of the presets and apply some of the styles. But for now, we're just going to go black and white neutral, apply that, oops, and go back to our settings here. Now, because it's a Phase 1 style, we've still got the ability to do all of these layer changes. What we can't do, though, is do anything about how black and white the image is. It's either black and white or it's not. There's no option here. We've gone from our color histogram up to our black and white histogram. Oh, that repair layer was down there, the little red spot. Just turn the mask off. No problem with doing that. And by doing it in black and white, now what we've got is a bit of a change in what our eye is looking for. So in color, and just to help people visualize this, when we see an image in color, we use color to separate objects. So we can see here there's a green field. We can see here there's some blue sky and some white clouds, and there's some more green in here. So we're using color all the time, as well as contrast, to see what makes the image. In black and white, we only use contrast. Our eye can only see the contrast because there is no color to differentiate. So we don't know that this field is green. And actually what happens is it starts to blend into the same area around it. So we need to add in some contrast. Well, we can do that pretty easily because we remember we've got A, our contrast tool, and B, we've got our clarity tool. But these two have already been used pretty extensively on the background in this shot. If we do it too much, we're going to end up with a very high contrast scene. It's going to look a bit odd. Because of the black and white conversion as well, these clouds have got a lot brighter. So overall, I'm going to pull down the whites and down the highlights just a bit there. What that does is it takes the focus away from these clouds, because in this one, the focus was held down here by the color. So because we've got this bright green down here, that's where the eye is going to. The clouds are sort of, well, they're clouds. We ignore them a little bit because we look down here. In the black and white version, there's no green to anchor our vision onto. So what happens is we get drawn to this area up here. So whenever you convert to black and white, remember you're changing what the viewer needs to see in the image from being color-based to being contrast-based. This is all about contrast. Now, one other way we could help with that is, of course, I could create a new layer called Sky. And we could create a new mask down there. So nice soft gradient mask. And with that mask, we could pull down our exposure. So again, we're pulling down the viewer's vision, or the viewer's anchor point, the point of focus down to here. We could pull that up as well. So that's one method of changing this to a black and white. And actually it looks really nice. We've got this lovely detail in here. We've got to deal with this in a second, which I'll come on to in a bit. We've got all of this detail in here. We've got these nice mountains. We've got this cloud sort of flowing over the hills. And as a black and white picture, that looks pretty nice. If I go full screen there, cool. However, there's another way of doing black and white, which is actually, funnily enough, using the black and white tool. So this is the quicker way, which is I can use a style and just apply a style onto an image. But within, let's go back to so I've created a new variant again, just to play with, or a clone of that variant. And within Capture One, we've actually got, in the color tab, something called the black and white tool. So first things first, I've got to enable the black and white tool. So I'm going to, rather than applying it to just the repair layer, I'm going to create a new filled layer. And I'm going to enable black and white. Now, the black and white tool itself will effectively flatten every other color option that we've been playing with down here. But it's going to use color to help me fine tune the black and white. And in a minute, I'll show you the importance of why color actually has an impact on how we do the black and white. So this is flat. This is black and white. Basically, what the black and white tool initially does is it just removes saturation from everything in the picture equally. So everything has had its saturation removed, every red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta, and it's just had its value converted to 0 to 255 in black and white. But with these tools, what we can do now is pick on individual colors that existed in the image. So remember this green area down here. This is all the greens on the grass. I'm going to zoom in to here. Okay, and if I pick on the green slider in here, this is about how bright or how dark the greens are going to be in the image. So that's with it bright, that's with it dark. And you see I'm only affecting the green parts of the image. I'm not affecting any other part. So let's go back to that little lens flare. What's the one over here? So in the color version, you see this lens flare here, or this lens dot here, where the lights hit either a piece of dust or something as well. This has got quite a magenta tone to it compared to the rest of the mountain. So in the black and white version, it's still there. It's just a faded area of the grass. I can pick on the magenta and say, actually, make the magenta areas brighter. Dot gets brighter. Or darker. So because I've only affected the magenta areas, and the only area in this image that was magenta was this dust spot, or lens flare, as a result, I can fade this out. So it's not gone completely, but it's certainly better than where it was. So that was where we were, and we darken it down so it starts to disappear. And that's a really nice way of getting rid of some of this stuff. So that's our magentas down. You notice it's not had any effect on anything apart from, there's it up, and there's it down, this middle dot. And we can do the same with reds. So reds, there weren't many reds in that picture from memory. If we go back to the color version, There's not much red in there, so this isn't going to have much of an effect. Yellows, a little bit down the bottom, so you can see down here where this area here wasn't all green, some of it was yellow, especially this beach area here. Let's go here. So with our yellows we can darken them, or we can bring them up. So darker there, bring them up there. Cool. So we can make those a bit more of a highlight. With our greens, we've already said actually we want to pull our greens up. So we knew this area was green here. So let's pull that green down. That's gone now nice and flat. Pull it up. It's now become one of the features. And what else have we got? Well, we've also got some blues down here as well. So, and cyans. So what happens if I pull our cyans down? Interesting. And what that's done is obviously where this area here was cyan, but this area wasn't. It's only affected this area out to the outside. And the same with blues. What happens if I pull the blues down and up? So there's an awful lot of blue in this image. We can see that on this picture. So all of this area here has actually got quite a blue tint to it. So with that blue, let's pull that back to where it was, otherwise we're going to lose the mountains. And we don't want to do that. But the cyan certainly we can pull down a little bit. So that's from a standard black and white picture here to an edited one that we can choose here. Now on this one we've got the sky layer obviously. On this one we don't. It's going to be quicker just to create a similar one so we can get to the same place. Let's pull down our exposure there in the sky. Cool. So that's the default version. This is the version that we can tweak. The difference between the version that we can tweak and we can't, if we look at these areas here and here, and look at these areas, they're kind of flat in the version that we've tweaked. This is now nice and bright and we've got a lot of detail here. This is still quite distracting in the black and white version. So again, in the color version, it's not too distracting. It's quite nice actually. But in the black and white version, it's taking attention away from that middle part here where the mountains were. So we've already got our sky layer. We're going to create a new layer called water. And with our water layer, we're going to draw a new gradient up here. Now, this is where we're going to use both tools together. So not only the gradient, but we're also going to use our high dynamic range tool, because if I just pull down the exposure, yes, I pull down this area, but I also pull down this area on the right-hand side too. So I'm pulling down the shadows equally at the same time as I'm pulling down the highlights. So instead of that, we're going to use our highlights tool just to pull down the water highlights and not affect the shadows. We could pull down our exposure a little bit, and then we've got another little trick here. So let's pull down our exposure and then use the high dynamic range tool to pull up the shadows and up the black area of the image. So we've flattened this area down here. If we look at this before and after, so that's before, we've got quite a lot of shine coming off of this part of the image. It's quite distracting. The second I pull in that gradient mask, so this red mask here, and we say, right, pull down the highlights, down the white areas, but pull up the shadows and up the black areas, that evens out this whole reflection here. That would equally work on the color version too, but we don't need to really on the color version because it's nice and smooth as a gradient. But on the black and white, this is really distracting down here. Once we put that gradient mask on with our high dynamic range, it just looks a lot smoother. So that's two different black and white edits for the same picture. There is one other little trick before I go on to the white balance issue, which is you can split tone black and white. So not all the time do we want our black and white to actually be black and white. We can actually choose to do, let's go, our highlights we're going to have slightly bluish, and our shadows we're going to have slightly yellow. So we've got an old-fashioned photograph. We could do the reverse, so we could make our shadows blue and our highlights yellow, and then we've got a cross-processed effect. So sometimes when you print on different film or on different paper stock, you get like a sepia effect or a cyanotype effect. This split toning tool within black and white also can allow you to do that. You can do it without using that. You can just do it using the three-way slide. Oops, sorry. I just turned off black and white, didn't want to do that. Let's just put those sliders back. So be careful, this little checkbox here that says enable black and white applies to both of these equally, and it'll turn off the master black and white. But what I can do is with this three-way color editor, even though I'm working in black and white, I can still apply a color feel over the image in terms of split toning. But this is where white balance becomes really important. So remember in black and white, in this one, it's just taking everything to 50%, this style. So when I go to our styles tab and say black and white neutral, it's going to flatten every single color down to 50%, or down to no color in there, and it's going to take the 0 to 255 value of that individual color and just put it into a black and white format. So it just takes away all the color out of our histogram. In our editable black and white version, so this tool down here, the black and white tool, remember in this version we were tweaking how much each color was playing with the black and white conversion. Well, going back to what we said before, we've got our white balance. So our white balance affects the whole feel of that image. So for example, let's go to enable our black and white tool. Remember we put magenta all the way down. Let's put magenta nice and bright. We've got our dust spot back. But what would happen if on the original image there was more magenta? So if I move our tint up, you see this area here is now magenta. What happens now to that black and white is this is going to get brighter. So with this tint change, I go from no tint here, no tint change, up to making the image more and more magenta. Because I've done that, my magenta effectiveness in that black and white tool is now even stronger on this area here. So be very careful. Even though we're only dealing in black and white, remember we're starting from a color image. So one thing I would say as a bit of a tip, make sure your white balance and your tint is correct to start with. If you don't, you're actually playing with colors that aren't necessarily real. So let's imagine that my the green area here was, I'm on the water. That's not going to help me. Let's go back to our background layer. Okay, so I'm going to change the white balance of this entire image to be more yellow and more pink. So we've now got an image which has got a lot more yellow in it and a lot more pink in the top. As a result, now when I enable my black and white, remember these sliders here? Well, this magenta one here is now only affecting, let's go in and zoom in here. There's a tiny little pink spot up here. If I turn this off, there's our pink. So this slider is now only affecting that area here. It's not having any effect on anything else. And the reason it's not having any effect on anything else is because everything else has been turned yellow, not magenta anymore. If I reset this back to as shot, we've got our magenta back. Now when I enable black and white, and because I took that magenta down, it's going to affect that spot. So just be very careful when, even though we're playing in black and white, just be careful that your original color image actually looks right to start with. If it's a little bit out, it's not the end of the world. But if you start with a color image which is completely the wrong tint or completely the wrong white balance, when you start playing around with the sensitivity tool in this black and white area, then you've got to be a bit more careful. So David has just asked, I'm just going to add it on there. So I guess I should remove the dust spot effect, but I like it. I agree. And I agree with the sentiment, which is this is entirely down to how you want the picture to look. So perfect example. Quite often we'll shoot into the sun for sunrise and sunset and so on. For that, we actively want a sun flare. So let me give you an example. I'm just going to switch across to one of Mark's images. Let me just put a bit of a filter on here. Let me remove the filters. Let's go to here. No, have we got one there? No, what Mark does need to do is clean his lens and his filters quite extensively, but we'll come to that later. I'm just looking for an example, but we may not find one in this pack necessarily. No, because okay, everything was particularly clean at that particular angle. Okay, quite often when we're shooting into the sun, what you'll see is the line of dots, which is the lens flare that comes out here. It's a natural thing. In fact, in Hollywood, quite often the directors are trying to add that effect in. They're trying to get lens flares in. So where you've got a sunshine and where you've got a really cool flare that comes out, it can look great to have those little dots that fly out of the middle of the pinwheel from the sun. However, as David's actually put on there, so on black and white, I agree the spot should be removed. So in terms of what's the right thing to do and when, let's go back to this image. In terms of this image, in color, I don't have a problem with these flare spots here. In black and white, without the removal of it, and in fact this one here, they can look a bit distracting. And the reason is because, again, the eye is looking for contrast, and we see that as contrast. So our eye is drawn to it more, we notice it more. So it literally depends on the way that you want the image to come out. There is no problem with using lens flares and sun flares and so on to dramatic effect. In the black and white version, I think it would be better to take it out. In the color version, that's just down to personal choice. Okay, let's go on to, let's just filter these, and we're going to go on to, very quickly, a city shot. I'm just going to cover this one very quickly, just because it's a bit of a handy tip that we talk about quite often. And that is the color and temperature of cities. So we talked about white balance quite a lot just now. Cities. Typically, and it's changing, obviously, as time goes on, so more and more cities now have a LED set of lights across the city, less of the sodium lights, which typically make the images yellow. So bearing in mind there's a sort of 10-15 second delay, who thinks this image is correctly white balanced, who thinks it should be warmer, and who thinks it should be cooler? And because I've said that, I'm going to take a second to have a sip of a drink while you guys answer. Oh, dead radio time. I understand what they get worried about now on the radio. While you're thinking about it, whether it should be warmer, cooler, or the same, what we are going to do quickly is try and correct this slightly uneven horizon. That's a bit better there. So Bruce says cooler. Right, so while we're going on there, Darren says cooler, cool. Let's just make sure our crop is nicely set here. Okay, cooler. Okay, so we have consensus from Ian. So on cooler. 10 points, right answer. Generally speaking, your camera is going to see the warm lights, and actually, generally speaking, the auto white balance in your camera is going to make a city always look warmer than it actually was, even with your eyes. As a general rule in Capture One, the average city that I shoot, the Kelvin or the white balance values, the Kelvin, which is the temperature of light, typically sits somewhere between 2,800 and 3,500. If it's higher than that, then generally speaking, your camera has assumed that it should be warmer than it really is. If I pull this image down, so let's forget tint for a second, I'm going to pull this image down to about there. That's probably more like the correct tone for this image, especially in Vegas. I can correct for a little bit of a green tint now, so if we look down here, some of these areas here are obviously meant to be tarmac concrete, so they would be typically grey. They look a bit green at the moment, so we're going to use our tint tool to pull them up and get them back to a bit more grey. Now, of course, that's one. I'm going to clone that variant, because the other option I've got is to use the auto tool. So let's reset the adjustments on this one and use our auto white balance picker, so this little pipette thing here, and we need to choose an area that should be grey. The problem here, and I'll give you an example. Let's click on that bit. That bit's cool. That was a grey area of the car park. Let's go to my version, that version. They're not too dissimilar. In fact, theirs is a little bit warmer still. It's not a bad move. Be careful though with what you think is grey. So, for example, this Luxor sign here is concrete, right? And concrete's grey. Let's click it. Ooh, it's gone very, very, very cold. And the issue is because that sign isn't proper grey. It's knowing it, it's actually kind of sandstony grey. It's sort of beigey, slightly yellowy grey. So when I'm using the white balance picker, be very, very careful that what you're clicking on should be grey, not slightly green, not slightly yellow, not slightly pink. It should be grey. And a good example in this one would be the grey in this car park. So if I now zoom out, and let's just reset that one. So there's what the camera thought was correct in its auto white balance, and this is typical for most cities you shoot at night. This is actually more accurate for what should be there in Vegas. I'm going to correct this Forgot. Oops, sorry, wrong tool. Let's click on our horizon corrector and just pull that across there just to straighten it. And we're going to move our crop. Okay. So there's a couple of things we can do in Capture One on this, and one thing that we're not going to do in Capture One. The thing that we're not going to do in Capture One is try and fix this ghosting here, and what that's come from is this massive light here. We've got a bit of reflection coming off it. I'm not sure whether it was from the lens, from the mirror, or whatever, but for some reason we've got a little bit of a ghost across here, that flare. If I try and do this in Capture One, to be honest, Capture One, as we said the other day, is great for image level editing, the whole image. When we start to play with individual pixel stuff or trying to create content that Capture One can't see, it becomes really difficult. So, you know, for example, we could create a layer here. I could brush over here and say, well, actually, it's mostly magenta there. So what happens if I go into my magenta area here in our color editor? In fact, let's pick on the color. Yep, it's picked up magenta. Cool. So let's pull down our saturation. Let's make our hue a bit more blue. Let's pull up our saturation a bit there. Hold down the Option key, make it darker. Then you can start to see the problem, because yes, that is particularly magenta, that area, but there's also magenta in the sky here. Can't really use the Luma mask because they're roughly the same brightness. What I could do in theory, so let's do this as well. Let's do a new heal layer. Let's zoom in to this area here with our heal layer. Let's choose a good bit of the mountain there. Choose our source with the Option key. Move along here. Ignore what the preview's coming up with. Just trust the tool. Okay, so we've got, yeah, it's trying. It's trying to get there. But to be honest, and to use the correct word, it's a bit crap. The reason is because it's really struggling to see what it can put there. I could use a clone tool. Let's try that. So new clone layer. Again, let's choose our source point here. But then, of course, there's a mountain here that's different. This mountain isn't the same as this mountain. So I'm creating false mountains now in this picture. So let's just paint the clone tool along here. There. Ugh. Okay. So in terms of the tools that are available to me in Capture One, yes, we could spend an awful lot of time trying to do this. However, this is an example where something like Photoshop is going to do a better job at it. So we can use some other tools and plugins and so on that can actually pull down this area here in isolation. We could use some content aware fill to get the sky back. We could use some clone stamping. And when we get into that level of detail, it's just going to be better to use something like Photoshop to do it rather than trying to get yourself into a mess in Capture One. Capture One is fantastic at editing the wider picture, about getting your colors right, about getting grading right, about getting the aspect ratio. You saw the Keystone Tool. It's impossible almost to do that easily in Photoshop. Capture One does it really simply. The second we get into this sort of stuff, other tools maybe help you a little bit more. But what Capture One can do in this case is correct for all of this massive amount of light in here, which has lost some detail. So this is where Capture One could do stuff that no other program can do quite as well, in my opinion, which is the high dynamic range. So first off, let's apply, we're at F14, we'll put some diffraction correction on there, just in case we've got some issues on the edges, and also some purple fringing correction on the high contrast points. Now in here, we've got a huge amount of detail that should be there, but unfortunately it's blown out with all these highlights. So let's go into our high dynamic range tool, and with our highlights, the obvious answer is let's pull them down. Look at all that detail coming back, and our whites, let's pull them down as well. So let's create we've already got our original variant. So there's our original. There's our new version. Just look at the detail that it's managed to pull back. And in fact, even in these signs here, I'm going to zoom in unfairly. So this was shot on a Canon 6D. So let's zoom in to this area here. We're going to be really unfair. We're at 247%. Let's go to 300%. So remember, we're at a ridiculous zoom level here for this image. You wouldn't normally print it at this level. Here's our original. And here's the version with all of that dynamic range pulled back. So even with an older camera, we can still pull back all this detail. So look at these lines here around these neon signs. compared to this just here washed out. Same with here. So there's the Statue of Liberty in front of New York, and there's the building behind. Now we can actually see the Statue of Liberty and the detail on the roof of the building behind. So even on slightly older camera models, and even at a lower resolution than some of the other ones, this view can be so much more improved by using that high dynamic range tool. If we had just tried to lower the exposure on the original, or the camera had tried to, that's great, but we'd have lost all the detail out here in the shadows. So if we look out here, let's zoom in another level here, we'd lose all of that, whereas in here we've got all this detail back. And in fact, we could even pull up some of this detail even more in those shadows. So we go from here, oh, let's correct our exposure. So as shot through to here. Now, of course, what we can also do with this one is, this is a bit too bright now up here as a result of pulling up those shadows. So let's put a new layer in with one of our lovely little gradients to there. I'm going to pull that sky down because after all, the sky at night should look dark. So there's our original. There's our finished one. Just changing things like white balance and high dynamic range, we get to a completely different feel for that picture. And in general terms, I'll repeat the numbers again just because it might help in future. So on average, an average city in terms of its base white balance, depending on lots of different things in terms of how many LED lights and how many sodium lights are around, is somewhere between, and again, it flexes, but 2800 to 3500 or 2600 to 3300. Lots of factors that will dictate that, but around the sort of high 2000s, low 3000s is typical. This one's come out at 3800 and a tint of 11. It's a bit higher than I would normally do. However, look at the original, 5790 in temperature. It's so much warmer than the reality actually was. And we know that it was really that cool because by clicking on the concrete down here with the white balance picker, it's automatically corrected it for it. We know that this car park shouldn't be green. The ground, this concrete isn't green in reality, it is grey. So we know that this is the right white balance. It's just the camera gets confused by all those lights in the cities. Okay, next session we will do, because our time is up, next Tuesday at 1 o'clock in the UK. I think there's weird clock changey stuff going on, so I'm not sure what that does yet to Asia and the US, but we'll try and work that out. So 1 o'clock UK time next Tuesday. People that we've edited files we will send across, and next Tuesday, Mark, we will start probably with this one and have a bit of fun with a block of ice. Cool. If anyone's got any questions, put them in the feed. We'll hang around for a second. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cool. Oh, I forgot. Just in case anyone wants to, remember you've got the ability to put in new images into the upload tool, and then we'll try and pull them into the session that we can the soonest. And if you need to send messages and stuff, just remember my name, because that's generally what works online now. Cool. No worries, Esteban. Hopefully see you next time, and we will catch you all later. All right, cheers, bye.